A shocking new poll shows that 47% of West Coast Democrats and 66% of Southern Republicans want to secede from the United States. Now, this poll does show several different regions, and I think they kind of miss the bigger picture here. When you account for all of the regions and all of the political parties, it comes out to just about 35% of this country wanting it to break apart in some fashion. The polls are by region, so it doesn't translate perfectly, but basically almost every region has at least 1/3 support from their people of breaking apart from the United States. It runs deepest in the South, where 44% of Southerners want to secede from the Union. Of course, the media is taking this and they're laughing, calling the South Confederates and likening it up to the Civil War, but they're all missing the bigger picture. The Revolution, the American Revolution. How many, what percent of the colonists do you think actually supported the revolution? Well, it's hard to know for sure. Some historians and many say it was 1/3, and they cite this letter from John Adams, but that's probably not correct because he was referencing something else. So many people have said. The estimates we usually get are around 40 to 45% in favor of independence from the crown, a revolution and independence from Great Britain. They say about 10 or 15% were loyalists and the rest were kind of just leave me alone. But there is a lot missing from this equation. And it's the ratio of politically active people to politically inactive people and population size. During the American Revolution, there were 2.5 million colonists. So you were kind of forced to be politically active in a lot of ways, though a lot of people, many weren't. Today, we have 328 million people in the United States, so it's an entirely different picture. We've heard from a lot of people talking about the idea of peaceful divorce. Peaceful divorce in this country, Balkanization, before something bad happens. I don't think we will get peaceful divorce. But when I look at this data, I look at the statements from Joe Biden, which are absolutely shocking. One statement where he said it doesn't matter so much who votes, but more so who counts the vote, which is a shocking thing to say. The system is broken if that's the case. But you see these statements and it shows. At least I would say it in my opinion, the left isn't going to win. The right isn't going to win. The United States will simply balkanize, break apart. And I think we've got data that backs this up. Shockingly, in the Midwest, they call it the heartland in this poll, not necessarily just the Midwest, because it's a different, they structure it a little weird. It's mostly independent voters who want to secede, but the numbers are huge. Now, we've seen calls for secession. In Oregon, you have several counties in eastern Oregon, which are Republican, voting to secede from the state and join Idaho. There's a big movement in Northern California for the state of Jefferson or joining Greater Idaho. People are not happy where they are. So when you see 47% of West Coast Dems saying they want to secede, keep in mind at the county level, things are very different and there's probably a lot of support internally. So what happens if they say they want to secede and the East Coast says no way? Yeah, you get chaos. And let's not forget, it was John Podesta who reportedly said, and this is a big DNC guy, big Democrat, reportedly said that should Donald Trump win in 2020, the West Coast should secede from the Union. This was reported by the Boston Globe. Ignore this at your own peril. A new report has come out suggesting, or outright stating, I should say, that an MIT prediction from 1972 is in fact correct. Society will collapse by 2040 due to economic constraint and population decreasing and things like that. And it seems like they were right this whole time. I want to show you the things that Joe Biden has been saying, because he's certainly not acting like a president of the United States. He's acting like a president of these Democrat states. And I'll tell you this too. There's some things I can't say on YouTube, but you take a look at the sentiment across the country. You take a look at the new reporting coming out from Tucker Carlson out of Georgia. Do you really think we are moving towards stability or not? Joe Biden said we are currently facing the greatest threat since the Civil War. He said the insurrectionists on January 6th were worse than the Confederates because the Confederates never made it to the Capitol. If that's how he views large portions of this country, in fact, maybe even 75 million voters, he's already said the we he refers to when he talks about this country is not red states. And I'll get more into that. But we got to read this poll first. Before we get started, head over to timcast.com to become a member, help support my work, help us expand, hire more journalists, launch more shows, help us build culture. As a member, you get access to our members area, which is a ton of exclusive members only podcasts, and will actually have articles, many, many more shows to come. I believe the new, our current soft launch target is this next coming Monday, to launch the new website. It's going to be fantastic. And from there, new shows, more content, more value, more bang for your buck, but more importantly, more journalists. We're going to be hiring more reporters. We got some interviews coming up this weekend. We already have, I think, like 6 or 7 people on our writing staff. It's going to be legit. And with your support, we can do it. Help us fight back against the lies in the mainstream press. Keeping in mind, I still use the mainstream press. I just have to dig through and fact check most of these articles and toss out the ones that are falsely framed or broken. And I think we're going to have an easier go of that on our own website than me constantly just doing it all day, every day. Plus, we're going to hire fact checkers. So don't forget, like this video, subscribe to this channel, share this video right now. That's the best thing you can do. We're trying to overcome censorship. We're trying to get the word out. We're trying to explain to people what's happening. I am not making this video to be hyper partisan or anything like that. Most of you probably know my bias is certainly not with the Democrats. I think they're awful. I think they're authoritarian. But perhaps you are someone who is politically independent, or maybe you're a Democrat or a leftist individual and you stumbled upon this video. I'm simply going to show you sentiment and what's been happening in this country that suggests we may be moving towards a complete break apart of this country. Now, I'm not saying it's definitive. I'm not saying it absolutely will happen. I'm saying these are signs it's possible. And we may be moving towards this. But again, not a hard prediction. Still, information you should have and then come to your own conclusions. Newsweek reports 47% of West Coast Dems, 66% of Southern Republicans want to secede from the U.S. They say 2/3 of Southern Republicans say they support breaking away from the U.S. and forming their own country with nearby states, while nearly half of Democrats on the West Coast would do the same. A 66% majority of Republicans in 13 states, they're repeating themselves. Let's move on. Support for forming a breakaway country reached 47% among Democrats in California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, and Hawaii. 1/3 of West Coast independents, or 33%, were in favor of its secession. Newsweek. Come on, guys. They go on. You know what? I'm just going to show you the chart because they very much are just repeating themselves. Support has increased significantly across the board since the same question was asked in a Brightline Watch poll from February, when only 50% of Southern Republicans wanted to leave the Union, 16% less. Data analyst Christopher Ingram described the poll results as the most disturbing data point he had recently seen on Twitter. In a post on his Substack online newsletter, Ingram noted that many of those who expressed support for secession may be expressing support to indicate partisan loyalties rather than support for a potential new civil war. That is an opinion which I find to be kind of absurd. Why would you even say that? It's not the question that was asked. No, people are getting mad. Let me pull up this image right here. For those that are listening, let me explain. Secession. Support for seceding from the U.S. to form a new regional union. There's the Pacific region, which is Oregon, Washington, California, Alaska, and Hawaii. 47% of Democrats in this region said yes. 33% of independents, yes. 27% of Republicans agreed. Overall, 39% of the people in these areas agree with seceding. That is the low end, just below the low end, for how many people we believe wanted revolution in the colonies. Keep that in mind. These are the politically active people, the ones who are voting, who are making the decisions. The people who don't know, don't care. They don't go out and vote. Some would probably vote against it. But this is significant. You also need to understand that 47% Democrats does not mean just around twice as many Republicans. There are substantially more Democrats in this region than Republicans. So this is substantive. In the mountain region, 32% support secession. In the heartland, 30% support secession. In the Northeast, 34%. And in the South, 44%. Now, this is completely unsurprising. In the South, it includes Texas and Florida, 2 states that defied Joe Biden's plan with COVID lockdowns. And when Joe Biden came out, I know I mentioned this a lot, but this is very important in this context. And he said, we may need more lockdowns. He wasn't talking about the South. He wasn't talking about red states. He was talking about New York, California, Chicago, or I should say Illinois, He was talking about the blue states. Joe Biden very much does not view Republicans as we the people or as us. When he says we are facing the greatest threat since the Civil War, he's talking about Republicans. I'm not exaggerating. Now, I want to show you a few things, just some context. May 19th, Oregon counties vote to secede to Idaho. Sentiment for breaking apart has already been happening. During the election, we had a 48-state lawsuit where they were fighting over the state's abilities to change voting laws and stuff like that. I mean, the states were split against each other. And it ultimately got dismissed. But it doesn't just end there. You don't sit there and be like, oh, the judge said no. All right, carry on. What's the next thing we're doing? Baking cookies. No. The people still wanted it. That's why they made those moves. Check this out. Texas Republicans endorse legislation to allow vote on secession from the U.S. from February. Now, this failed. The Oregon secession likely won't go anywhere because you need congressional approval and state approval, and like Oregon would give up territory. But it shows many people are actually starting to, with words and policy, demand secession. Here's Joe Biden. The National Review. Biden labels GOP voting laws greatest threat to American democracy since Civil War. This should be the biggest indicator. Again, maybe you like Joe Biden. Okay, by all means. You like Joe Biden, and maybe you agree with what he's saying. What's your proposal to deal with the GOP when they're coming out outright saying we must do this? The GOP says we need these laws. We cannot have the lax voting policies of the pandemic persisting indefinitely. We have given many people options for voting because it was a pandemic. Well, we want to wind those down. Joe Biden says that's the greatest threat since the Civil War. If you agree with them, how would you deal with 75 million voters and potentially more than that who vote Republican when it comes to these policies? The greatest threat since the Civil War is the Republican voting laws. He also said that insurrectionists were worse than the Confederacy. I mentioned that. There was a tweet, I think it was from Vosh, a renowned leftist on YouTube. And he said something like, either these people, he said something about these people need to be removed or something like that because you can't function with them in society. We've heard people express similar things. How do you have a functioning government when people just adamantly disagree on their worldview and they can't tell what's true or what's false? That's it. We're not arguing policy anymore. It's over. There was a point where being a Democrat meant, you wanted pro-choice, and being a Republican meant you were pro-life. And for the most part, we were like, we're Americans, we support America, but this policy must change. Now, what are we arguing about? I should have the right to vote this way. No, you can't vote that way. We're not arguing policy anymore. We're literally arguing over who gets to control the system. National Review. Speaking from the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia on Tuesday, President Biden forcefully condemned the wave of election integrity laws recently passed in red states. Of course, Democrats said it's voter suppression, calling the laws an assault on the right to vote and the most significant threat to the U.S. since the Civil War. There is, quote, an unfolding assault taking place in America today, an attempt to suppress and subvert the right to vote, Biden said. We're facing the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. That's not hyperbole, since the Civil War. What do you think that means? When Republican states are passing laws, they say to secure their election. The Democrats say they are passing laws to secure their elections. Both accuse the other of violating the rights of their citizenry. Both are arguing over the system and not the policy. Why? Because we do not view ourselves as part of the same America. This is true. It exists. The divide is real. It's not a joke. It doesn't matter if you believe in it, if you feel it or not. Joe Biden has said what Republicans support and are proposing is a bigger threat than the Civil War, or the biggest threat since the Civil War. He goes on to talk about the insurrectionists. Look at this. The Confederates back then never breached the Capitol, as insurrectionists did on January. Biden said, extending the Civil War analogy. I'm not saying this to alarm you. I'm saying this because you should be alarmed. And you should be. Throughout the speech, Biden sought to tie the election integrity laws recently passed in Republican-led states like Georgia to the Capitol riot. I'd like to show you a quote from Joe Biden. This is from the whitehouse.gov briefing room transcripts. He says, while, everyone claps. Well, actually, I'm sorry. I'll back up. The 21st century Jim Crow assault is real. It's unrelenting, and we're going to challenge it vigorously. While this broad assault, he said while twice because people clapped. This broad assault against voting rights is not unprecedented. It's taking on a new and literally pernicious forms. It's no longer, this is a quote from Joe Biden, it's no longer just about who gets to vote or making it easier for eligible voters to vote. It's about who gets to count the vote, who gets to count whether or not your vote counted at all. It's about moving from independent election administrators who work for the people to polarized state legislatures and partisan actors who work for political parties. To me, this is simple. This is election subversion. It's the most dangerous threat to voting and the integrity of free and fair elections in our history. Never before have they decided who gets to count, what votes count. Literally, you did that. They do it all the time. It's called adjudication. It's called signature verification. Is Joe Biden proposing that no matter what, every single vote, regardless of where it comes from, is counted? How can we function that way? It is. The Democrats repeatedly said, count all the votes. And Republicans responded with, count all the real votes, implying that some weren't, or more importantly, there's a process. If you don't have your address on it, we can't verify it. We have voter security for a reason. I'm in favor of securing our elections. I agree with Jon Stewart that people need to have some tie to the community when it comes to voting. Stewart almost said service guarantees citizenship like Starship Troopers, and he's on the left, or maybe he used to be. Who knows what they'll say about him now? But the Democrats think there should be no one who determines whether or not a vote is correctly done, legitimate or otherwise. If it comes in, it's good. Even if it clearly looks strange, that is stripping away 100% of election security. Why would Joe Biden propose that after we went through all this stuff with Russia? Don't ask me. But again, maybe you found this video and you are a Democrat and you agree with Joe Biden. You think I'm wrong, but that's fine. What would you say to the Republicans who are refusing to allow you down this path? You can say they're evil and they want to suppress the vote. By all means, go ahead and say it. What do you do with 75 million Trump voters? Do you just call them evil and walk away? I don't know. They're going to vote. And their states are going to pass these laws. The Democrats had no power in Texas. They could only flee the state. And they got support from Democrats at the federal level. So what do you do? Perhaps the end result is going to be more sentiment towards breaking apart. I pulled this up on Reddit. It's an interesting thread. What percentage of American colonists were in favor of independence? A lot of people seem to think it's a third because of this letter from John Adams. I've actually read this multiple times, but it seems that it's actually between 40 and 55%. Now, this is just an Ask Historians post. In the actual academic literature, Robert Calhoun says between 40 and 45% of the white population in the 13 colonies supported the Patriots' cause. Supported the Patriots' cause does not mean actively fought. Keep that in mind. 15 and 20% were loyalists, and the remainder kept a low profile. Now, think back to that chart. 44% in the South, 50% of independents, 66% of Republicans, and 20% of Democrats want to secede. That is near the higher end of the historical view of how many people wanted to declare independence. Now, the South has tried to secede from the Union before, creating their own country, essentially declaring independence, but they failed because, as Ulysses S. Grant said, we have paid blood and treasure to admit you into the Union. You can't just leave. There is a debt owed. And a lot of people keep saying things like states can't secede. The Constitution doesn't allow it, blah, 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 blah. I don't think Parliament allowed the colonies to secede either. I don't think they had the legal authority to declare independence. But legal authority is relatively meaningless. It's about the people who can assert and then win. Fortunately for the British colonists at the time, when the United States declared independence, we actually thought we were going to lose. But the French intervened and created such a headache for the British, they ultimately got routed and said it's just not worth it. Does that mean something like this will happen in the U.S.? Well, let me tell you something. The fracturing of these regions, of which there are 5, is not the same as one, region breaking away from the crown. The Commonwealth remained mostly intact and the colonies broke away. In this instance, imagine if, this is the entire country splitting into 5 parts. Now, will that actually happen? I don't think so. Will the South secede? Probably not in the way people would think. I don't think we're coming to a point where the South is going to have a regional convention and then declare that they are, once again seceding or something like that. I don't think that would actually pass in a referendum or a vote. Keep in mind, in the Civil War, the states didn't put up to a popular vote. It was the state representatives who ultimately voted to secede. However, with the continual expansion of, escalation, I should say, of the rhetoric from Democrats and Republicans alike, regardless of who you think is right or wrong. Of course, I think there is one side that is more correct than the other. I believe more in individual freedoms and personal liberty, even though I am, left-leaning in policy, like universal health care and things like that, and government-paid social programs towards parental leave and things like that. I ultimately find myself more interested in personal responsibility. So I don't think we can mandate these things and force people to pay for these programs. I would just advocate for them. And if my argument works, hey, people agree and we pass these things. That's called left libertarian. But the Democrats are left authoritarian. They're ideologically driven. Now, I'm sure there may be some Democrats who say I completely disagree. Of course, I'm just explaining to you what my bias is. And by all means, you're free to disagree. How do we function in the same country when we will never agree with each other? We both view each other as completely wrong. The left would call me far right. I mentioned Vosh actually on my show. He said I was far right. And I'm like, but I support leftist economic policy. How am I far right? It's weird, isn't it? Because it's about tribe. Whose side are you on? Do you support the machine or not? Now, if these regions break apart, that rips the federal government apart because the federal government is a creation of sovereign states. I can't tell you exactly what will happen, but I want to put it this way. I don't see it as Texas and Florida and Tennessee or whatever having a meeting and saying, I hereby declare we are seceding once again. That's not going to happen. Check out this story from Vice. MIT predicted in 1972 that society will collapse this century. New research shows we're on schedule. They say, the MIT study predicted that rapid economic growth would lead to societal collapse in the mid-21st century. A new paper shows we're unfortunately right on schedule. The estimated time frame is, I believe, 2040. A remarkable new study by a director at one of the largest accounting firms in the world has found that a famous decades-old warning from MIT, based on, is civilization collapsing, appears to be accurate. As the world looks forward to a rebound in economic growth following the pandemic, the research raises urgent questions about the risks of attempting to simply return to the pre-pandemic normal. Perhaps this is why there is the Great Reset, because we saw what MIT predicted. We've seen the fourth turning predicted. We've seen Thucydides' trap predicted, and they're panicking. We got to do something else. It's almost like you see a movie where someone comes back from the future and they're like, the robots take over, and they're desperately trying to figure out what to do to stop that future from happening. Kind of feels like that, right? Well, regardless of what happens in the future, I'll put it this way. Or I should say, regardless of whether or not society collapses, whether this is right or wrong, I will say, if things do start destabilizing in any way, not towards collapse, but just rocky road, then it becomes harder and harder for this country to stay together. Society may not collapse in a way that we end up like in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, but it could collapse in a lighter way. That tensions between states become so severe, tensions between Democrats and Republicans become so severe, that ultimately cooperation just ends. That's it. It doesn't have to be a great vote. It doesn't have to be a great war. It doesn't even have to be a peaceful divorce. Just a gradual collapsing of several bridges between these regions. And then eventually you have certain states saying, like, we don't actually do deals with these other places. Or you might have New York saying, we're not going to let people in if they're not vaccinated. Texas says, we are not mandating vaccinations. So then so then New York has to put up border barriers. Gradually over time, you just end up with a balkanized United States. That may be the actual reality. I want to tell you about some of the things that have happened because I think this shows the country is on the verge of that collapse. What could precipitate states saying no and barring the federal government. First, we have this story from Cincinnati.com. Immigrant advocates discuss Sheriff Jones dropping ICE contract. They say Butler County Sheriff Richard Jones announced that, this is back in May, that he notified ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that effective immediately, his jail will not be accepting any ICE detainees and will be terminating the contract, which he has held since 2003 to house them in the future. Why? Well, what they were saying is that the federal government would be like, hey, here are some illegal immigrants, detain them. And then once they did, they go, now release them. And they would effectively just start releasing these illegal immigrants into their communities. And finally, the sheriffs are like, we're not going to do this anymore. You're just shuffling people to where we live. Then you have this story. Tucker Carlson reports Biden administration using Texas Air Force Base to secretly transport illegal immigrants. Well, that's Tucker. But this story actually came out, I believe, over a month ago. Whistleblowers and video got released showing that Joe Biden was human trafficking migrant children to various states, some red states. Tennessee representatives were outraged when they found out the Biden admin was smuggling human beings into their state, dropping them off in random community centers and areas like churches. Do you think that the states will just allow Joe Biden to do these things? Or do you think they'll eventually start putting up checkpoints at airports? So when the plane lands, they say, who are you and what are you doing here? And then they say, passport, please. Why? Because Joe Biden is transporting non-citizens into their states. So you don't have a passport check when you're flying domestically. But what happens if what happens now that Biden is doing this? I wouldn't be surprised if Tennessee passes a law within the next several years, maybe not, and says, we're going to do a document check, not a passport, but an ID to prevent this. And maybe not if they're using Air Force Base and they're using government, federal government planes, then it's going to have to be wherever that plane lands. When people are coming off and entering back into the airport, they say, and please show me your ID. And there will be border checkpoints at the airports. That also means they'll have to put up border checkpoints at the highways into and out of the state. This will be the path towards the U.S. completely breaking up. With that in mind, the prospect of a political pressure which creates an involuntary secession, you also have the willpower. That is, combine these things with the fact that many people already want their region to secede. And you'll eventually get a bunch of people just saying, yeah, more barriers, more borders, more barriers, more borders. We only accept these IDs now. Passport's not good enough. You need to prove you're from this place. Plus, with the vaccine passport that Joe Biden said he will be supporting from the private sector, imagine what's going to happen when a trucker comes to New York. They're going to have to stop the trucker and say, have you been vaccinated? The trucker's saying no, and they're like, turn it around. You can't come in. So then truckers from certain states won't go to other states. Eventually, you get balkanization. That's where we're headed. We've got the expansion of federal authorities. We've got the expansion of Joe Biden going after people on the right. The Democrats are fighting. The left is fighting. The Republicans aren't. Some are, many regular people, but not in an organized way. AmericanMilitaryNews.com reports Capitol Police to use Army surveillance gear to monitor Americans and identify emerging threats. That sounds like a violation of the First and Fourth Amendments. Probably a bunch of other ones, mind you. Why are the Capitol Police going to be monitoring Americans? I think the reality is when you hear what Joe Biden said, that the GOP and their laws that they propose, which they support and their voters support, it's the biggest threat since the Civil War. He's saying the Republican Party is. Now, he is going to use federal authority, Capitol Police, to surveil political opponents. The people on the left think that January 6th was the worst attack since the Civil War. Joe Biden has said it over and over again. Not every single person on the left, but enough of them. The people on the right say that it was bad, it was a riot, but it was not much more. Many people peacefully walked in and had no idea what was going on, and now they're being arrested. That's right. Joe Biden is exerting as much federal power as he can to go after people, many of whom did nothing. And I mean it. A trespass. Okay, fine. In one instance, there's a video of a man who walks into an open door being held open by cops and then looks around. He has his hands in his pockets. They're charging him. There was a woman where the cops opened the door for her on video. They're charging her as well. They raided the home of a woman in Alaska who wasn't even in the building. Joe Biden is stopping at nothing to use the power he has in federal government to go after his political opponents. The question is, are the people who are acting at the behest of Joe Biden all Biden supporters? Or is it possible many of them are going to say, I don't like this, and eventually stop? And what happens then if you have some FBI agents who are not on board with this authoritarianism and they just say outright, like, I'm not doing this one, and start defying federal orders because it's crossing the line? What happens if Joe Biden orders some federal law enforcement to do something and they say that crosses the line? We won't do that. And then they stop obeying the chain of command. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. I really don't. But I'm not surprised to see the sentiment is rising. And that's the fact. Whether it's Republican or Democrat or independent, sentiment in favor of secession has been growing for some time. So what can you do? I'd stay away from cities. Big cities. Small cities are mostly fine. Personally, I moved out to the middle of nowhere. We have our own little garden we're setting up, and we grow tons of vegetables. We got too many carrots, man. Too many. We grew too many carrots. We should grow other stuff. But the harvest has been bountiful, and we are grateful for our chickens and our tomatoes and cucumbers and zucchinis and all that good stuff. Take some responsibility for your life and your survival and for your family, and don't sit back and rely on a government that is in chaos. There was a report we saw recently that the Navy has prioritized diversity training over combat training. How can our American Navy actually function if that's the case? Destabilization is happening now. So we'll see how things play out. But there are some pros and cons. I'd say I mostly worry about this because I fear China taking over. They've already got 3 or 4 times as many people as we do, and they're growing in influence and technology. However, it's also possible that instead of having 1 U.S. Army or military, you have 5 if the country really breaks up. And what I mean by that is all of these regions are going to start pumping out weapons, and we're already armed to the teeth. Yeah. May you live in interesting times, to put it mildly. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up tonight at 8 p.m. over at youtube.com/TimCastIRL. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all then.